So perhaps I can start with the first question, which is, how serious do you see the climate crisis is for the Mekong region specifically?
For the Mekong region, well, it's not serious for everyone, but for the Mekong region, I think it's exacerbated by a lot of the other human behaviors that are going on here, by government policies that seem to favor damming and water control of the Mekong for human purposes, rather than taking into mind the natural ebb and flow of the river. Government policies that seem to prefer or encourage monocultures, which encouraging the chopping down of forest and the total reduction of and the removal of all wildlife from a certain area.
And do you feel that the governments are really seized of the importance of acting now on the climate crisis, or are you seeing a sort of sigh of relief that says, oh, wow, everybody says that we were racing to 2050, so we're going to find the solutions in the last 20 years?
Unfortunately, I think the latter, possibly the sigh of relief, but also battles within the government. So that some of the government environment ministers do see the importance, and they seem to be pushing for it, but there are other ministers within the government who seem to be making policies that allow for, as I say, large infrastructure, monoculture cropping, certain countries, I think Cambodia, heading towards more coal-fired power stations, and they seem to be able to be, those projects are getting the nod, and possibly because we've given ourselves until 2050 rather than encouraging everything to start happening now, as it is, in my opinion, it needs to.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing from our part of the world, and even worse, I'm seeing, unrelated really to tourism, indirectly to tourism, they're still giving massive subsidies for fossil fuel prospecting. It's
right,
kind of madness. You'd think they'd be giving subsidies for renewable energy, for solar, for wind, and I'm sure solar could be a good thing for your region.
Solar certainly would be, but yes, it's in Thailand. It's tied up in regulation. I think Vietnam was pushing ahead, but they seem to be going a little bit backwards as well at the moment. So yes, people are still talking a lot of being set in an old mindset, I think, of doing things because that's the way they've always been done, rather than looking for new innovations and looking for ways out of it, unfortunately. Which isn't helping wildlife and biodiversity at all, and in the end will not help tourism.
And how about your elephants? How are they coping with the sort of immediate changes? And how do you see, if we continue on a similar trend, how do you see it will affect the elephant population?
It will be, at the moment they seem to be coping. Certainly wild elephants still seem to be breeding and increasing where they are, so there is some protection in place. But what we're seeing in the weather is more extremes, as with everybody else. So we would have two extreme dry years. We've just gone through a period of two extreme dry years, and now we're in an extreme wet year. And if that continues and we end up having longer periods, or if you end up with having three or four extreme dry years, then we will end up with droughts. And on the other hand, on the other side, as we're seeing at the moment, we'll end up with floods, and that will make life extraordinarily difficult for animals that have that require, well, first of all, have evolved to be in this area, but also have had their backup areas, if you like, the areas that are now very human dominated and monoculture. They've had those taken away, particularly particularly in places like Myanmar and Cambodia, again, that were relatively forested up until, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago, and now are not. So yes, it'll all be, climate change will come, and everyone says if it does get worse, then the backup to save the wildlife is no longer there to help them either.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think it's a when rather than an if.
Yes.
The latest IPCC report, which the UN Secretary General called a Code Red for Humanity, basically says that we've used up 1.2 degrees of that famous Paris 1.5 degrees in 5 years. And that was supposed to be a sort of 2050 timeframe. So,
Yes.
you know, you only have to look around the world to see the fires, the floods, the droughts, to know that there's a kind of terrible inevitability about this whole thing. And you mentioned
Yes.
floods, John. I think I'll make this my last point with you. You mentioned floods. You know, the Mekong region is defined by the river. What impact, how bad if we start to get sort of severe flooding, how bad will that be just for life in Mekong countries and for tourism and for wildlife?
Well, we're actually seeing the opposite due to the dams at the moment, which is not what we came on to talk about. But we have had one of the wettest years ever in the Golden Triangle, and yet our seasonal floods, the floods that used to come seasonally and that we relied on, and that further down the Tonle Sap relies on and the Mekong Delta relies on, just didn't come, even though we've had extreme weather. So if we get hit with, or when we get hit with the next drought, that's going to be really, really disruptive if the dams are still not allowing the water to flow. When we can have the wettest or second, third wettest year on record and no seasonal flood because it's being held back, I really do fear for the next drought, because water will be held in the dams. Water will still be, people are still following their own needs for the dam. The reason the dams were built were hydropower, and nobody's thinking about the natural pulse of the river. The floods, on the other hand, funnily enough, because we've had a wetter year, the less dammed river in the watershed, the Chao Phraya in Thailand, the floods are on that river because they haven't got dams.
Yeah, I think this is one of the issues, John, that it's the unpredictability. You actually can't say it's going to go in some sort of straight line projection because nature doesn't operate that way. And if man has intervened to create artificial situations, as you mentioned, like monoculture or like damming rivers, the capacity for nature to respond to these unexpected crises is severely reduced, and that's my worry. That's why we're talking about a dash to zero rather than a race to zero, and going beyond declarations to actually acting and doing things. And I'm really pleased. I'll bring this to a close. I want to thank you for taking the time, but I'm pleased because of what my friend Jens has done in his tenure in the coordinating office to make sure that the environmental issue and the crisis issue is actually kept to the forefront as well. And you know, I'll finish by thanking you for this and saying that from where I'm sitting, there is no region in the world which is basically more dependent on having a predictable climate to make nature operate in its own unique way. So thanks so much for taking the time today, and it's good to see you again. I hope.
Yeah, I'm talking out of one of our ventures, a small little eco lodge in the south of Thailand, and where we have just traveled a couple of days ago, and just marvelous to be here. So yeah, I'm sitting in a tropical rainforest, so slightly disheveled and somewhat warm, but that's the reason why.
Well, you can have a nice Dutch beer, I'm sure that.
I will, we're certain.
And by the way, the sound and the quality of the picture, it even makes you look good.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, that is technology.
Yes.
You like my filter?
Yes. Well, but I want to just ask you about the big issue of climate change or climate crisis. And first of all, how do you see this as an emerging mega challenge in the Mekong region?
Yeah, this region is, well, the name says it alone. It's the Mekong region. And it's named after the river that pulls through this area, and it originates in China and then runs through Myanmar, past Laos and Thailand, into Cambodia, and then ends into the South China Sea in Vietnam. And of course, the water levels of the Mekong River are, for example, of enormous influence of these countries, really enormous. And that's partly due to climate, partly due to human activity, damming and all of that kind of thing. But still, you can see like it's nature is something that is untamable, and we gotta live with it, and we gotta, you know, deploy all our ingenuity to make sure that, you know, we remain in a livable area. And it's delicate. So yeah, one thing I can say, it's our region is, yeah, one of the areas that is, you can see where how delicate nature is, and how delicate any kind of influence is it, human influence or climate change influence can be on a livable area where we are in right now, let alone as an area for tourism where we can actually receive travelers.
Yes, and to your point on the Mekong, I spoke to John Roberts about the same issue, and he pointed out that the Mekong is already suffering from sort of damming, which has kind of changed nature's way of the river flowing. So when you add the climate impacts on top of that, the reality is nobody quite knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think you hit a nail on the head. Nobody really knows what happens. I think what we can agree on, it isn't much goods that will come out of it. It's just a matter of how bad will it be. But as soon as you start to mess with nature, so to speak, it becomes really, really unpredictable. And yeah, everywhere in the Mekong River and tributaries like the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia, through tidal activity and through the stream upstream from the Mekong River fills every year, and that level of water is just decreasing every year. So again, it can be partly man-made and partly climate change, and sea levels, rising sea levels in, for example, the South China Sea, means that the tidal, the salt water, the brackish water will come into land, and that means that former aerial land is not, they cannot plant rice anymore. Another part is Bangkok, where right now we are facing incoming floods, and that also has to do with rising water levels in the sea, where, you know, the typical flow of the river is more difficult to get in the sea. So we live with it basically on a day-by-day basis, and it influences us. Floods influences us, and we can't really control it. And I think that is the scariest part. Yeah, things happen and we can't control it.
And it affects those elements which you wouldn't say are tourism, but which tourism is absolutely integrated with, like the food chain, or how people are behaving in cities and things.
Yep.
It's a massive issue. And from the perspective of Yana Ventures, your company, how are you responding, and how are you preparing for the future?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, we with everything that we do, we try to, well, not only try, we actually follow the triple bottom line. So we are a for-profit company, and our ventures that we do are for profit. But we do that only if we have built in a triple bottom line. So also look after the environment we are in, and also look after the community we operate in. And I think where we are here right now in Anorak Lodge is probably a very good example of that, because we are here and we are working on a reforestation project right on our land here. All our employees from the local community, save from the general manager here, everybody's from the local community who we employ. And yeah, it's a beautiful area. So this is one part. The other is that we have a DMC that is probably our 800-pound gorilla still in our portfolio of companies. It is an 8-country incoming DMC, destination management company. What we are doing there is we are trying to get people enthusiastic about adopting to slow travel. And again, if you go back to the Mekong region, for a while it has been very popular, and there are reasons for that, by the way. It has been very popular to combine in one holiday 2 or 3 or even 4 countries. So say, for example, you arrive in Thailand, you want to do a couple of days in Laos, then you go through Vietnam, a couple of places, you end up in Angkor, and you fly back from Bangkok again in a 3-week space. That obviously will need that you need, what, 6, 7 flights in one itinerary. And will your experience actually be any better than what you will get if you take, for example, 2 countries, but you do much more overland travel and you stay longer in one place and you discover more in one place and you meet a community and you actually contribute maybe something. You will have a better experience while traveling, while of course your carbon footprint will be much lighter. So that is one other thing that we can make people aware of, and our partners, our tour operator partners aware of. And yeah, I think it's a better experience. So the end experience, yeah.
I guess you can get the communities more involved once you're doing that kind of a package, because they'll have their guests for a little bit longer. The guests will have time to integrate a little bit into community lifestyles, rather than we used to say years ago, the European tour was today, it must be Brussels, tomorrow it must be Amsterdam, I think you're kind of bringing that mentality into play.
Yes, absolutely. That is exactly what it is. It's just not just doing all what we call the highlights. In other words, the thing that we read in that we are preconditioned to know about the destination that we have never been to. So because of the guidebooks and the online platforms, we think we know what the highlights are because everybody tells us that's what the highlights are. But are these the highlights for you? Because you might be interested in food, and and then the best food you might not get in the biggest place where most tourists go.
Regions, especially young people in Myanmar needs to have more education about the climate crisis. We still haven't seen any much awareness about the climate crisis. Of course, they have been complaining about getting hot and much hotter and hotter, and we feel hotter and hotter. More flat we have been facing. A lot of serious the disasters which we have been facing in 2021. Even recently, we are supposed to be in the cold season, but we are still receiving a lot of rains, and which make a lot of negative impact in our environment. So the people are still not having, especially young generation, have not having this awareness yet, because we need a lot of propagation and we need a lot of education. I think serious education about this serious climate crisis.